schedule, the course schedule, you'll see that we are doing Intro to Digital today. So this isn't a very long PowerPoint. It's just that. It's sort of an introduction to the terms that we're going to be looking at in a lot of detail next semester. Hey. And you also notice that you have a test on it this week. Okay, so it is a very short test. It's not very long at all. So because we don't really have anything in lab to support the Intro to Digital, like we do for everything else, where we'll have it in lecture and then we do activities related to it. We don't really have that. So that's why I felt like it was okay to do the test this week, because there's not really anything in lab that's going to help with that. Not till next semester where we're really getting into some of the details of digital imaging. So we're going to do this, and then I'm going to give you back your practicals from last week, let you look at those, and then I'll take those back up. And then if you have questions related to anything about the final practical, we'll definitely have some time to do that at the end. Did you see that I put that recording? Did anybody try? Did it work? It did. Great. Okay. All right. So digital imaging is like this big umbrella, okay, that different things fall under. So digital imaging is any image process, so any means of acquiring an image that produces an electronic image that can be viewed and manipulated on a computer. So this sort of shows you, I've blocked out part of this because we'll get into the rest of it next semester, but just so you can sort of see, okay, you have the big digital imaging umbrella, and then under that you see that you have film digitizer, digital radiography that's broken down into CR and DR, and then digital fluoroscopy. So we will get into the specifics of CR, DR, and digital fluoroscopy next semester. So the first exposure to digital imaging that we had was through a film digitizer. And so it converted actual radiographs into digital images. So we actually took the film that we had, the pieces of film, and we ran them through the scanner, and that gave us our first digital imaging system. And so my first experience with that was back in the early 90s. And so you can imagine it was a headache because we were still using film, and then we were having to run every one of those films through this scanner, and quality wasn't great. It was okay, but nothing like what we have now. And so the thing was, the ER docs, they still wanted to see the films too. I mean, they liked the fact that the images were digital, but they still wanted, so we were having to do both, make sure that the digital image went across, but also we had couriers that couriered, whatever that word is, our films from us in our x-ray department around to the emergency room. And so that was really a nightmare. I mean, a nightmare. You can imagine they would get shoved up under stretchers. Hey, they would, I could put my glasses back on so I could see. They would get lost. The residents would just take them wherever, leave them places in their break room. And so this was the beginning of the push towards digital imaging. So it wasn't great, but it was better than nothing. Then we got CR, computed radiography. So cassette based or cassette-less I never worked with CR that was cassette-less, meaning that everything was built into the equipment itself. I always worked with, you had a cassette, sort of like the detectors that we have now. You had cassettes, and it was very similar in the process of using film. So the cassettes almost looked identical to the film cassettes. And so it was, that part of it wasn't a big transition. We were used to that already. In a CR system, it uses photostimulable storage phosphor plates inside of the cassette instead of a piece of film. And after the exposure, the cassette was placed in a reader where that PSP plate was scanned. And the thing about that was we could open those cassettes, to white light, and it wasn't a big deal. If we opened cassettes that had film in them to white light, it was a big deal. That film was then worthless because it had been exposed. It would be completely black when you put it through the processor. So that was a big difference for us. We were used to going in a dark room to have to open our cassettes to put the film in the dark room, and then it would come out on the other side. But we could open these and check for if they needed cleaning or if they had artifacts on them. They were dust collectors for sure. And so they would get specs on them, and we'll see that next semester when we're talking specifically about CR. Again, I never saw this type of system where the PSP plate was located inside of the piece of equipment, such as an upright Bucky device. The technologist there wasn't a cassette or a plate to handle. So I never actually saw this, but it was a part, the PSP plate was built into it. It was a part of the image receiver assembly, and the plates were scanned within the equipment. So with all of the CR equipment that I ever used, there was a separate reader. So you had your cassette, and you used it just like we use the detectors as far as like centering and all. And then you took that cassette and you actually physically put it into a reader, another piece of equipment, and it would take the plate out and scan it and then erase it and then shoot it back out to you. This is just in general what's happening in that reader. You can see that there is a neon laser within that equipment, and the plate would move through and it would scan that plate and then collect the light that came off of that through a light guide, and that was sent to the photomultiplier tube, which was then sent to the amplifier, and then was converted from an analog signal to a digital signal. And again, we're going to get into more of that next semester. I basically just want you to sort of understand that in the reader was where the plate was actually removed from the cassette and scanned, and then that information from that got converted from analog to digital. So just briefly, does everybody sort of understand the difference between analog and digital? Analog is like a continuous, think of it this way. You can have two types of clocks. You can have an analog type of clock, which you can see the hand continuously moving. Every single time of the day can be displayed, right? But then you have your digital clocks, which is what we mostly have now, where only a finite time can be displayed, right? One particular time can be displayed because it is a digital clock instead of the analog that's continuous. So again, we'll get into that more next semester. So direct digital radiography is what you guys are used to. I am trying to remember, I don't think, maybe anybody been to International, POA on International over there near
I think I have.
do they still have a CR system?
Yeah, one
Okay. That's probably the last one that I know of our clinic sites. They are slowly phasing out, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Several years back, I want to say it was 2018, Medicare and Medicaid stopped paying for images that were done on CR. So that was the push to try to get places to convert to direct. Is if they're not paying for those, then that's a lot of money that hospitals and clinic sites were losing. So that's how they sort of forced them to start converting, because it's an expensive process. So that is why a lot of places like Patewood, I know, I want to say Piedmont Ortho at Grove have what we call retrofitted rooms, which means they were CR type of rooms, and then they got retrofitted so that they are now using direct detectors. But what do you have to do in between each one that you're doing in the bucket tray? In and out. That's why, because it was originally a CR room. And so that was one of the safety features that were a part of those rooms, is that if you had made an x-ray, if you had made an exposure in the Bucky, it would not let you expose again until you had taken, it was trying to prevent you from double exposing. So if you forgot to switch your cassette out, it wouldn't let you shoot. So that's why those rooms are like that. It's aggravating. You know, you get so used to the direct like we have here at school. And so if I were working there, I know I would forget to do that a lot. But your direct digital radiography systems use detectors that receive the radiation and convert it into electronic signals. They can be built into the equipment or they can be portable. No separate reader is necessary, and the images are available instantly following the exposure. So generally within 4 to 5 seconds, your images are popping up. When this says they can be built into the equipment or portable, that means like our equipment that we have here, our Siemens rooms, those are considered portable detectors, because we take those and we use them in the wall Bucky, or we use them in the table Bucky, and then we can use them also free detector tabletop. Some of your rooms, like room 3 at Memorial. Anybody been in there yet? Room 3, the main like routine room. You know how at the wall Bucky it's built in. You don't have to put a detector in there. It's built in. So that's what that's talking about. So some rooms can have both, where you have it built into the wall Bucky, but then you have a detector that you can move around and use for patients that you can't stand or you can't move. So some of these terms now that we're getting into that you're going to need to know. The matrix is a pattern of cells laid out in rows and columns that cover the entire area of the image. Now, this is very exaggerated just so that you can see. A pixel is, you can get many pixels generally, even on a pinhead. Okay, that's how small pixels generally are. So this is exaggerated, but just so that you can see. So the matrix is just the rows and the columns, so that we can have a specific location in the image and a specific brightness level for a particular area of the image. The pixel is the small, usually square, smallest element of the digital image. The pixel is the smallest element of the digital image. So picture element is just abbreviated into pixel. That's where that term comes from. So one of those squares in that matrix would be the pixel. And so a lot of this stuff you're probably familiar with just from purchasing what? For your homes? TVs, computer monitors, right? Yeah, yes, exactly. So this terminology, goes across a broad spectrum of things. So one thing to remember about your pixel values is that they are recorded as a single numerical value. That is termed quantization. So every single pixel is assigned one value. It has one value. And that responds to one particular area within that patient or volume of tissue. And that value that is assigned to that pixel is determined by the amount of radiation that reaches the receptor or the receptor exposure in that particular area. So every single pixel in your matrix is a location. All right, just like if you have a table and you say, okay, look at row 5, column 3. That's a particular spot in that table. Same thing with the matrix and the pixels. Every single area in the digital image, it has pixels that represent the location in the image and a value that represents how much radiation did that particular area receive. So this is just a visual of that. You can see, for example, if we had, which you don't really have to understand this right now, but a very, very low bit depth, then there would say be 8 different pixel values, 1 through 8, and every single one of those would represent a different shade of gray. Okay, so if you had this type of bit depth, you can see that the computer is going to see the image as the image on the left, correct? Because the computer is seeing numbers, all right? We still have to see in analog. All right, if we just saw that 2828, 84648, can we tell anything about that? No, our brains can't do that. So we still actually have to see that in analog. So that's why every single value is assigned a shade of gray so that our brains can process that and understand the, see the difference. So this is the way we would see it. Everywhere there's a 2, see how the same shade is assigned? And we'll get into the real specifics of that in like the first part of when we start digital next semester. This particular slide is to help you understand, and don't get too hung up in the high density, low density. That again is an older film term that you're really not going to see much anymore. We talked about the overall darkness of a film image. That's how we relate it. Density was the overall blackness of the image. Whereas with digital imaging, we're talking about what term? What term do we talk about with the image? It starts with a B.
Brightness?
Huh? Brightness. Yeah. So instead of talking about how dark is the image, we're now talking about brightness, how much light is coming through a particular part of the image. So it's talking about the same thing, just in different ways. So the areas of the pixel that are very black represent more or less exposure. Think to the marshmallows. More. So the dark areas represent more receptor exposure. The very bright areas or the lighter areas represent less receptor exposure. Think about it. The bones show up as what? Bright areas, right? And there's going to be less radiation under those areas of the image due to the absorption of that radiation in the bone. So when it says high density, that just means it was dark. So I'm not going to ask you questions related to density because those are terms really that you're not really going to see anymore. So just understand that very bright areas in the image represent less receptor exposure. Very dark areas of the image represent more receptor exposure. Again, think back to the marshmallows, right? So the darker the marshmallow, the longer it was exposed, right? Or the more exposure it had. So if you get confused, just think back to this slide here. The very burnt marshmallow had the most exposure. So we have different qualities of the image, and we've already sort of grouped these into those 4 big quality factors that we've been talking about this semester, but we'll break them down just a little bit more here into the visibility of the image, which is, we're talking about things like brightness, contrast or grayscale, and noise. And then the geometric integrity of the image is what we literally just did this last unit, which was spatial resolution, size distortion or magnification, and shape distortion. Those are the geometric factors that go into the entire like quality of the image. So again, you've seen this already. This image is visible. We can see the entire image, but it's not sharp. It's very blurry. And this image is sharp, but all areas of it are not visible, right? We can't see the entire bridge because of the fog. So that fog would be what we would consider created noise on that image that's preventing us from being able to see that particular area of the bridge. So brightness is the amount of luminance or light emission of a display monitor. And so this second sentence here, I want to read it and then I want to explain what I'm saying here. The inherent brightness of the image based upon the technique initially used to produce it, but is manipulated by the computer to maintain overall image quality. So what that's saying is, with film, when we talked about density, you saw on the film itself the difference in exposure from one film to another. So if we used a correct mask on one and we used twice that mask on another just for kicks, the overall blackness of that second image would be twice what it was on the first. It would be noticeably darker. Okay, you could visually see it. What this is saying here is, with digital imaging, we can do that. We can use a correct mask for one image, double that mask, and the overall brightness does what? Stays the same, looks the same, because the computer is trying to maintain that overall image quality. So it's making adjustments in the background so that that image is displayed to look like you used the correct mask. So that's a great thing for us as, you know, radiographers. It cuts out a lot of repeats due to technique, but it's also what?
Bad for patient exposure?
Yes. If we don't pay attention, you know, to our EXIs, which Avery's got a big old smile on his face, like he knows that doesn't happen. And I know that a lot of times it doesn't happen in clinic. They're just busy and they're just doing it and they're not looking at it. And you go, man, you know, you're thinking to yourself, this EXI or EI or whatever value it is, it was supposed to be 700, it's 1400, you know. So I get it, but I'm just saying that we are supposed to pay attention to that. So when it says that the inherent brightness of the image is based upon the technique initially used to produce it, that is true. The values that are assigned to the pixels are dependent on how much receptor exposure that area received. It's just that when it is displayed, that automatic rescaling has already taken place so that those values have been adjusted so that when it's displayed, it looks like you used the correct technique. So that's brightness. That's one of the terms. Contrast and grayscale is we've already learned about this. It's the difference between the brightness of two adjacent details. We can also think of it as the number of shades of gray in the image. Noise is any undesirable input to the image that interferes with the visibility of the anatomy of interest. The most common form is from scattered photons. So there's different kinds of noise. We can get quantum noise, which just means we didn't use enough mass. There weren't enough photons to create the image without that mottled or grainy appearance. Scattered photons. So again, that's why we try to minimize the amount of scatter that reaches the IR through the use of beam restriction and grids and that type of thing, keeping our KVPs at an optimal level so that we don't have, I don't know if y'all remember this or not, but when we did the KVP unit and we were talking about contrast and we kept up in the KVP till we got 106 on that abdomen, and remember how just noisy it began to look? That's because there was, you know, more scatter reaching the IR than typical on an abdomen. And so that's why we were seeing that. So spatial resolution, we just went through. So that's the amount of detail in an image, or the amount of, or how well we can see the structural edges or lines in the image. Can also refer to the smallest object that can be detected in an image, and we'll do some calculations next semester on that. Size distortion or magnification, the misrepresentation of the size of the image as compared to the actual object or anatomic part. So this is the first year that I have put this content at the end. And so I think it works better this way because you guys are already familiar with these terms. I'm not having to try to explain every single term because we've really already talked about them and had them. Shape distortion, the misrepresentation of the shape of the image as compared to the actual object or anatomical part. Resolution or visibility, the ability of the imaging system to distinguish between two adjacent details as being separate and distinct from each other, takes into consideration everything that went into producing the image. So again, you can think about that picture from several weeks back where there was, it was actually two rectangles, and in one image they looked like all one, and in the other image they still look like two. And we said that the image where they still look like two would have the best resolution because that you could see that those are two separate and distinct structures. So think back to that picture if you get confused. Exposure indicators. On page 109 of your Faber book is a good little blurb about exposure indicators. It is the number that's displayed on the image to indicate the level of X-ray exposure received to the image receptor. Something that I want you to understand and know, it is not a measurement of patient dose. It does not measure patient dose. It measures receptor exposure dose, not patient dose. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about your exposure indicators. If you use the correct exposure factors, then it should give you an exposure indicator that's within an acceptable range and give you the best image quality. You have to know what your indicators are for the system you're using and what relationship they have to exposure. Meaning, you need to understand if it is a direct relationship, like in other words, if your exposure indicator has a direct relationship to receptor exposure or inverse, because it matters, right? There's a lot of places out there that are still that their exposure indicator is an S number or a sensitivity number. I know that the POAs, it is inversely related. So if your S value is high, that would mean that you were underexposed. So if you have that backwards, that's bad, right? You would be changing your technique in the wrong direction. So there are still places out there, and I say still, new equipment coming out that use S values. So that is an inverse type of relationship. Up until, I may have told y'all this, up until they got their new room at Greer, and I think that's pretty recent, Greer people. So you know how they have those two? The one on the left is the older now. Okay, so before they got that new room, this one's I think they have let's see, what is it called? EXIS, I believe is their exposure indicator. That's a direct relationship. You know, meaning if your EXIS was high, you used too much. If it was low, you didn't use enough. This room with the old software, it was inverse. So even though it was, I believe, still like an EXI of some sort, it was inverse. So you have to know what relationship it has. And we don't expect you guys to memorize all those. That's why there's supposed to be something labeled or placed in the clinic sites to help you know what kind of relationship it is, because you're going to 20 different places. And in that case, the same clinic site has two rooms that have different ones. So if you don't know or you don't see it posted somewhere, you can ask, your tech, what kind of relationship does this number have to exposure? And if they don't know, then you can let us know. We can try to figure that out for you. We can try to find that out as we're out and about, because you need to know. Unfortunately, there's not a universal system at this time, but manufacturers are moving in this direction. Well, they've been moving in this direction since about 2009, and it still hasn't happened. They are very manufacturer specific. So most of them are directly related, but there are still a few that are inverse, which is what I just talked about. So quantum noise is an indication of underexposure, quantum meaning number. So in this case on the left, you can see that's a decent looking proximal femur or AP hip. The one on the right is not diagnostic because of the level of noise that is in that image. Does everybody see that? You see that grainy look, that sort of salt and peppery look? That is photon starvation. So that's a new term that the ARRT and the ASRT brought into the curriculum probably a year or two ago. So it's talking about quantum noise or photon starvation. There just wasn't enough mass used in that image. And that's why you get that awful looking, noisy look in that image. Now this one is saturation. It's an indication of overexposure. So saturation is loss of information in some areas of the image, loss of data. In other words, the computer cannot automatically rescale this to appear diagnostic with just automatic rescaling. It can't do it. It's overexposed to the point that it can't fix it. So the only thing you can do on this, and I don't even know if you can tell, that's a wrist. So it's overexposed to the point of you just got to do this one over. It's too much. It's like that sponge that's been dipped in water and you bring it out and water drips out of it. It's saturated. It can't accept anymore. It can't do anything with it. It's too much. So no amount of, window leveling is going to fix this. You got to do this one over. So with film screen, if the image was underexposed or overexposed, the only way to correct it was to repeat it. So this is what I was talking about earlier. It was there was no denying. If you used half of the mask that you should have used with film, you were doing it over. There was no way to correct that. If you used twice the mask that you needed, sometimes we try to get by with using hot lights. We call them hot lights. We would, especially in the OR, man, you'd go back in the OR. If you had done when it was dark, you'd turn all the lights off in the room, you'd put it up in front of the hot light. That was, so again, overexposure was better than underexposure, because with underexposure, there was nothing you could do except repeat it. With overexposure, we could turn the lights off. We could use the hot lights and put down on talking about a really bright like spotlight that we could turn on and put the film right in front of it. It would just put more light through it. So with digital, you can see that if this image right here was done at 2 masks, and this one was done at 8 masks, and this one was done at 32 masks, do you notice a big difference in the brightness level of those 3 images? No, they all pretty much look the same, don't they? Now, as we get to that 32 mask, what's starting to happen to contrast? Yes, it's going down. It's less contrast. It's getting more gray looking. That's because as that KVP is going up, there's going to be more scatter hitting that, and it's becoming more uniformly penetrated. So it's still trying, the computer's still trying to fix it. And as far as brightness goes, it really does look about the same. With digital, the computer can fix as much as 50% underexposure and really over 100% overexposure. So we have to be mindful of the ALARA concept or dose creep, which is what we were sort of talking about a minute ago. If you're not paying attention to your numbers, then let's say you're using 4 masks on a knee, and you have the next patient, you know, a while later, and you say, really can't remember what I used. I don't want it to be underexposed, so I'm gonna go ahead and use 5 this time. And over time, doses can continue to creep up and creep up and creep up because we don't want noise in the image, right? We can see that the computer can't fix as much underexposure as it can over. So doses tend to creep up if we're not paying attention to those numbers. So when it says it can fix as much as 50% underexposure, meaning it can automatically rescale it to look like it should at about 50% under, but we can really overexpose upwards of almost 400%, and the computer can still fix it. Look at this case. That's way more than 100%, right? And it still looks okay. We still don't have saturation. So easy to do if you're not paying attention. How are we on time? Oh, good. So medical image management and processing system, MIMPS. This is supposed to be taking the place of the term PACS. Now, you've probably all heard PACS. They say, hey, did that go to PACS? Or did you send that to PACS? Or can you go look on the PACS? That's what they're talking about. Is it used to be known as Picture Archiving and Communication System. That is just your system where digital images are received, stored, distributed, and displayed. Okay, but a couple years ago, they decided, let's call it something different. Okay, I have yet to hear one person in clinic refer to it as MIMS. I have not heard it. So I'm sure that that's common, but it's still, your PACS has been around so long. I just have a feeling it's going to be a while before people actually call that. But you need to know both, because this is in the specs for the registry. The major components of your PACS system are your imaging modalities, meaning diagnostic, CT, MRI, ultrasound, whatever your modality is, your communication networks, your display workstations, and your archival capabilities for storage and retrieval. So just in overview, you can see that you can have your different, so you have your different input modalities, whether it's CT, diagnostic, MR. You have a server, you have your workstations scattered throughout the clinic site. There's 3 basic components. You have to have a computer to store the digital images and the direct communication within the system. You have to have a server to connect all those components, and you have to have a workstation to view those images and that information. Some advantages of MIMPS or PACS was direct viewing at multiple workstations, the integration of paperwork with those images. So when this says at multiple workstations, when we had film, you only had that one copy, right? You did a patient on film, that was all you had. So how many people could look at that at one time? Well, whoever happened to be standing there. So if you had a surgeon in the operating room who had the films hanging there trying to do the operation, and they had a question about something, the radiologist couldn't see the films, right? So that was an issue. So when we say that an advantage is that you can see those images in multiple places, that was life-changing, right? It was also life-changing because now we didn't have to worry about films getting lost. Now, we still have to worry about one thing related to that, and that's if you don't make sure that you have the correct patient's information on that image. So let's say you're having to type stuff in because maybe the system's down or something, and you're physically typing stuff in and not like scanning something or pulling that information that's already in there. If you type something wrong, it's going to go in its own folder and it's not going to be linked to that patient's information. So we can still make mistakes, but it's not like it used to be where it was just awful. If they lost the films, we would have to do them over, and you hated repeating patients just because somebody lost the film. Teleradiography is where there may be radiologists in Montana reading images for this ER, MD, whatever it is. Every year, y'all go there. Over at Cherrydale, the big place. Anybody been there yet? Emergency MD. I think you'll go there as seniors, maybe. But there could be radiologists from anywhere across the country that are actually reading these images. And so that's what teleradiography is. The ability for, people anywhere really on earth to be able to read those images. It doesn't have to be somebody physically on site anymore like it used to be. And the image manipulation capabilities that we have now with digital imaging, the things that we can do with the images afterwards, like, drawing arrows to point at stuff, or doing measurements like we did last week in lab, or, just zooming in on areas to be able to like see better and that kind of stuff. There's so many capabilities that we have, but one thing to remember about that is, as far as manipulating your image, you don't want to do a whole lot of that manipulation of the image and then saving it and sending it to PACS that way. And we'll talk about that next semester, why that's important that we don't. Really and truly, if you do everything the way you should and you use the techniques that you should, there should be very little manipulation that you do to the image afterwards. The capabilities are there, but you really want to leave those to the radiologist. Let them do what they want to do, because if you make manipulations to your image like brightness or contrast and you save it and send it to them, then all that original data or information is lost, and it limits them as to what they can do with the image afterwards. So, all right, any questions about any of these terms that we went over? Anything that's not clear? So really and truly, you've already learned a good many of the terms, because we've talked about all those big things. Okay. All right. So what I want to do next, I'm actually going to, I'll keep the recording going in case. So I want to open up for questions about the final practical. If anybody has any questions about that, section 1, we'll be doing that today. Ooh, that's bright. Wake up. No questions?
Just maintaining receptor exposure.
That's it. The goal is to maintain receptor exposure.
And we just have to be able to say what each thing does to different.
Mm-hmm. Like overall, with your case, what happened to receptor exposure? And remember, data that you're going to use to determine what happened to receptor exposure is going to be what? What numbers are you going to use for that? EXIs, right? 25% of EXI1. Does EXI2 fall in that range? That's the data you're going to use for that. Is there data for contrast? No. So you're going to use just descriptors or something. What about spatial resolution? What data are you going to use for that? Yes, unsharpness numbers. And when I say use your data, I literally mean use your data. It was this, and it was this on the second one, therefore this. Don't be vague. I'm having you calculate and do that stuff because I want you to look at those numbers and determine what happened. What are we going to use for size distortion? Magnification factor or percent of magnification, whichever you prefer. What about shape distortion? Do we have data for that? No, but we talk about what? What relationship? Say it loud, I can't hear you. CR to the part to, that's right. Yeah. Let's see here. Right off the top of my head, that might be confusing, but anything else?
We increase the mass and like when you increase the SID, it's because of the loss of intensity.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So when you increase the SID, you're losing intensity, therefore you have to increase the mass to compensate for that. Yeah. And the opposite would hold true. You decrease the SID, then intensities get greater, you don't need as much mass. Anything else? So I'm gonna give y'all your practicals back to look at, and I do need them back. But I'm going to run down and open the lab. And so y'all have some time in between here, between this and Yolanda's. And so it'll be open, and then of course you can get in as soon as Yolanda's class is over. Section 1, y'all can go ahead and get in there. And then when we're done with lab, each group will have time to practice for Yolanda's for this week. Because that's all we're doing. This is the last one. Okay. All right, let me just stop the recording real quick, and I'm gonna let y'all